Now, you'll notice a series of books here. I'm going to mention this one now. This is called a narrated Bible. This is a chronological Bible where they take basically the what we can figure out about when these things were written and what they were written about, and they're organized so it tells a single linear story. In the Old Testament, Chronicles and Kings are both stories about the same kings. They squish those together. When David has to run for his life and, his wife at the time is covering for him when Saul is trying to kill him, and then we have Psalms that David wrote at different times in his life. They pop up where they pop up in his story. But for tonight, part of the reason I bring this up is because this actually takes all four Gospels and meshes them together. So that if you look at the handout here, just above a whole different animal, you got 4 arrows. There is a time of preparation, there is a time of public ministry, there is a time of private ministry, and a time of the passion. Those 4 units of Christ's ministry and life are consistent no matter which gospel you're looking at. And a book like this takes the entire Bible, unzips it, and then reshuffles it in chronological order and breaks it into 365 sections with narration. So in other words, when you go to your daily reading in here for today, he'll say, well, this is what's going to be happening today, and here's why it's happening, and here's why it matters. So let's read it together. That is incredibly handy. And then that means that whatever happened in Mark, whatever happened in Luke, whatever happened in John, it all gets put in one place so that we can look at it more closely and have a better sense of, for example, the woman with the issue of blood who had it says in Mark that even though she spent all her money on doctors, she wasn't any better. Very negative view of doctors. Luke, being a physician, when he writes the same story, says, and even though the doctors did everything they could for her, they couldn't help her. Do you begin to see the flavor and the way these different writers approach certain material? And when you have something like a narrated Bible that zips it all up next to each other, it just makes it that much easier, folks. So if you turn it over, you're going to see a lion, an ox, and a man kneeling in prayer. And I do want to give my thanks to Kyle. He actually drew these for us. Thank you, Kyle. And so let's start with Mark. Mark is the suffering servant, okay? He wrote primarily to Romans. Now, the reason this would matter is Romans, they don't have the background. They don't necessarily know very much about Moses or the Old Testament. And Romans were very much about hands-on, action-oriented, and the use of power. So when Mark wrote his gospel, he definitely wanted to show that the Messiah is the suffering servant who makes his way to the cross on purpose and intentionally. Because you got to understand that back then, it would be, okay, let me put it to you this way. Raise your hand if you remember 9/11, like you remember the day. Okay, that's all of us. All right, so on the day, if somebody wrote a report about what happened, it would sound a certain way. Explosions, actions, and so on. Because when you're right at the center of something that happens, you write about it one way. Now on the other extreme, let's say in 2050, somebody decides to write about 9/11. He's going to write about it very differently, especially if he was there. And now he's an older man, let's say he's in his 70s or his 80s, and he's writing about 9/11. He's going to see it very differently 50 years after the fact than the guy who's writing about it just after the fact. Mark is a storyteller, okay? He uses the word immediately 26 times. And immediately shows up so many times. Immediately Jesus did this. Immediately Jesus did that. And so Jesus as the suffering servant, you got to understand, even up to the cross, Jesus is in charge. Now to Romans in particular, for a bunch of Jewish people to be going on about a guy that was publicly executed as the worst kind of criminal, and to see people talking about a cross would look very strange to them. Basically, it would look like what if we wore nooses around our neck because we worship a guy that was on death row and publicly executed. To some degree, this is how it looked to Romans back then, this being the most recent gospel and the Roman government being the ones that executed him. So in the same way, he tells the story well with a good amount of detail, but it's the kind of detail like, for example, we're going to go over this in a minute, when Jesus goes to his hometown. Only Mark mentions his disciples came with him. So what if you guys are all my cousins, and I'm coming back from being out of town, and I show up and I stand up here and I'm trying to tell you guys that things are this way? That's one thing. It's another thing if I come here to see my cousins and I show up with 6 disciples on each side, or sitting right here on the front row. That's going to carry a very different vibe. Well, Mark's the only one who bothers to record that little detail. There's stuff that happens in Mark that you don't see in any other gospel. So going back to Mark, right here in the center of the diagram, almost half of Mark is the Passion Week. The Passion Week is from the triumphal entry when they're hailing him as king to the death and then the resurrection. So out of 16 chapters in Mark, at least 8 of them are about the Passion Week pretty much. And out of the entire New Testament, Mark is not a very long book. It's only about 8.2% by word count. And action over words with power is very much, so it's less what Jesus said, it's less what Jesus taught, it's more, man, the demons see him and they beg him because they know he's got power over them. It's Jesus, he acts and that person is healed. It just shows what Romans would have understood, that Jesus had the power to overcome, and in any situation he drew all men to him for better and for worse. You know, the demons would run to him. I mean, wouldn't it make more sense for a demon to run from Jesus? But they were compelled. There was a magnetism. There's lines in Mark where it says the crowds were so thick, you know, the disciples couldn't eat, or they were almost crushed by the crowds. I mean, he generated excitement wherever he went. And that's kind of how Mark works. And so it focuses on Galilee. Okay, let me explain this. So basically, Israel, as it existed back then, and to some degree how it exists now, is like a strip along the coast. All right? And the lowest part is Judea. It's got Jerusalem in it. This is at the time of Christ. The middle portion is Samaria, which has its own things going on. I may take time to explain later. And then north is Galilee. So the bottom is the most Jewish, and it's got their temple. The middle is mixed with people who intermarried with Assyrian conquerors, and it kind of distorted their religion. So they're kind of like, they're considered half-breeds or mongrels. They're not full Jews. That's how people saw them back then. And then Galilee, the upper province, is the most Gentile, the most non-Jewish. And so it makes sense if Mark is writing to non-Jewish people, he would tend to talk more about Galilee, including the Gentile territory. So Mark has no birth narrative. It starts at the baptism, and it speaks of the cross in terms of a horrible suffering endured. Now that was a lot to take in. So we're going to catch our breath, and we're going to look at the story here of Jesus being rejected in his hometown. And Rob, would you mind getting a couple of handouts to our guys back here who came in late? I want to make sure everyone can see this. So since we start with Mark, that's what our diagram told us. We start with Mark. It says that he went away from there and he came to his hometown. This is Mark 6, verse 1. And his disciples followed him. I already mentioned to you, this is the only one of the 4 stories of Jesus being rejected in his hometown where we see that his disciples came with him. Now that adds a bit of realism. That adds a bit of immediacy. If a guy shows up to hang out with his cousins and his disciples come with him, there's going to be a little bit of tension. And that's a story detail from a storyteller. And on the Sabbath, he began to teach in the synagogue, and many who heard him were astonished, saying, where did this man get these things? What is the wisdom given to him? How are such mighty works done by his hands? Now, Mark is the only one where they say, is not this the carpenter? In Matthew, they call him the carpenter's son. There's an interesting story detail. How did Jesus become a carpenter? He would have taken on his adoptive father's trade. He would only be the carpenter if his father was dead. Instead, he would be the carpenter's son, the way Matthew mentioned it. This is a little story detail that Mark is there to show us that when Jesus comes back to hang out with his cousins, his father's dead. And his disciples are there with him. These are storytelling details that Mark is bothering to show us. The son of Mary and brother of James and Joseph and Judas and Simon, are not his sisters with us? And they took offense at him. And Jesus said to them, a prophet is not without honor except in his hometown. Mark adds this, and among his own relatives and in his own household. And the others, it just says hometown. So that sharpens the rebuke that Jesus is laying on them. And whereas in Matthew and in Luke, or in the other Gospels, it doesn't really include this kind of uncomfortable detail. It says he could do no mighty works there, except that he laid his hands on a few sick people and he healed them. And This is the only one that records Jesus' response. He marveled because of their unbelief. But then it shows us that didn't stop him, because then he went among the villages teaching. So the focus here is on power and on faith. It heightens the tension like a good story would. It definitely lets us see the sharp disjunction that we've got going on here, because this is how a storyteller would lay out that event. Does that kind of help a little bit? Let all this content breathe for a moment. Let us see Mark a little bit differently before we go on and we talk a little bit about Matthew. Okay. And I will be leaving room for questions at the end.